The second day of June, 1854, dawned on a city that barely recognized itself. Boston, the very cradle of American liberty, was a city under occupation. Federal troops and more than 2,000 armed guards lined the streets, bayonets fixed, holding back a crowd of thousands. Buildings were draped in black crepe, flags hung upside down, and from the throngs of citizens came a low, steady sound of hissing and booing. All this, the entire military and legal might of the federal government, had been mobilized to escort one man. His name was Anthony Burns. Born into servitude in Stafford County, Virginia, he had defied local laws by teaching himself to read and write with the help of local children. While hired out by his owner, Charles F. Suttle, Burns experienced a profound moral awakening and determined that he, too, should be free. In early 1854, he found a sympathetic sailor and stowed away on a ship bound for the north, arriving in Boston after 3 weeks at sea. He found employment in a shop on Brattle Street and began to build a life. His freedom lasted only a few months. Burns made a single, devastating mistake. He wrote a letter to his brother, who was still enslaved in Virginia. Though he had it postmarked from Canada in an attempt to disguise his location, the letter's contents gave him away. The letter fell into the hands of Suttle, who immediately acquired a federal warrant under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. On the evening of May 24, 1854, a federal marshal named Asa Bootman stopped Burns on the street, arresting him under the false charge of a jewelry store robbery. Burns, knowing he was innocent, complied peacefully. He was walked to the courthouse, but inside, he was met not by a jeweler, but by his former owner, Charles Suttle. In that moment, Burns knew he had been caught. The city's abolitionist community, which had been fighting the Fugitive Slave Act for years, erupted in outrage. A mass meeting was called at Faneuil Hall. But for some, the time for speeches was over. A militant faction, led by a minister named Thomas Wentworth Higginson, had no interest in mere words. Even before the meeting at Faneuil Hall had concluded, Higginson led a determined group of angry protesters, black and white, to the courthouse. They armed themselves with a large wooden beam, using it as a battering ram to storm the door. They were met by armed guards. A chaotic fight broke out, and in the commotion, a federal marshal was killed. The rescue attempt, however, had failed. The breach was sealed, and the abolitionists were repulsed. The federal government, determined to make an example of Boston, ordered the full enforcement of the law. This led to the vile procession of June 2nd. The cost to the city to return this one man to servitude was staggering, but the cost to the nation's conscience was higher. As the thousands of armed guards escorted Burns through the jeering crowds to the wharf, a profound shift was occurring. This public display of federal power, used to enforce a law many saw as immoral, was a turning point. It was, for many, the moment they realized that the federal government was now an instrument of slave power. The conservative Boston merchant Amos Lawrence, whose family wealth came from textile mills that used Southern cotton, captured the transformation. He wrote that the Burns affair had radicalized him and his peers. "We went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise union Whigs," he claimed, "and waked up stark-mad abolitionists." For Thomas Wentworth Higginson and the other militant reformers, the lesson was even clearer. The law had failed. Peaceful resistance had failed. The city had been humiliated. As Anthony Burns was placed on the ship and returned to Virginia, those who watched knew that something more than just the law would be needed to answer the crisis. But the incident with Anthony Burns was not the first time the 1850 law had been tested in Boston. It was merely the most tragic. To understand the fury of 1854, one must look back 3 years earlier, to a different man, a different case, and a stunningly different outcome. The year was 1851. Shadrach Minkins had been living as a free man in Boston since 1850. He had escaped from Norfolk, Virginia, likely by stowing away on one of the many ships that steamed north from that port. He settled into the vibrant black community on Beacon Hill and found steady work as a waiter at the Cornhill Coffee House, a tavern in the city's commercial heart. He was building a new life, but he was doing so in the shadow of a new and formidable piece of legislation, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This new law was a powerful and, to its opponents, a terrifying tool. It strengthened the earlier 1793 law, empowering federal marshals to seize anyone accused of being a runaway, and it mandated that all officials and even ordinary citizens of free states must cooperate in their capture. A person accused of being a fugitive was not entitled to a trial, and their fate could be sealed by their supposed owner's word alone. It was this law that would be tested for the first time in all of New England on the morning of February 15, 1851. That morning, Assistant Deputy Marshal Patrick Riley and other agents entered the Cornhill Coffee House. Shadrach Minkins served them. Minutes later, the marshals revealed their true purpose. They arrested Minkins on the spot. He was the first person seized in New England under the new law, and the city's abolitionist network mobilized with shocking speed. Minkins was dragged to the Boston courthouse at 26 Court Street. The Boston Vigilance Committee, a secret group of black and white abolitionists formed specifically to resist the 1850 Act, was alerted. Prominent black activists, including the lawyer Robert Morris and the community leader Lewis Hayden, immediately took charge. While Morris and other lawyers flooded the courtroom, filing one motion after another to tie up the proceedings and buy time, Hayden was organizing a different kind of response. Hundreds of anti-slavery activists, many of them from the black community, gathered outside the courthouse, their anger growing by the minute. Lewis Hayden was not a man who trusted the legal system to protect liberty. He believed in direct, physical action. He gathered a small, determined group of about 20 black men near the courtroom. They were not there to petition or to wait for a judge's ruling they knew would likely go against the fugitive. They were there for a rescue. Inside, the legal arguments stalled. Outside, the crowd pressed against the doors. The small group of rescuers, led by Hayden, moved closer, positioning themselves for the signal. They watched the marshals, saw their opening, and tensed for the charge. The plan was set. They would not allow the federal government to take this man. At a signal, they pushed past the stunned guards, surged forward, and burst through the courtroom doors to overwhelm the marshals. While the abolitionists of Boston fought the Fugitive Slave Act in their courthouses and on their streets, one man had already taken the fight to the frontier, believing the time for legal challenges was long past. His name was John Brown. Born in Torrington, Connecticut in 1800, Brown was a man of profound, unyielding convictions. He was raised in a devout family with extreme anti-slavery views. His life was a portrait of restlessness and failure. He married twice, fathered 20 children, and moved his family relentlessly across Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York. He failed at multiple business ventures, from tanning to land speculation, and declared bankruptcy in 1842. But one thing was consistent: his singular focus on the destruction of servitude. He believed he was an instrument raised to strike the death blow to the institution. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad and founded a league to help fugitives escape to Canada. In 1855, at the age of 55, Brown followed his sons to Kansas Territory, bringing a wagon loaded with weapons. He arrived in a state of chaos. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had decreed that the territory's status would be decided by popular sovereignty, igniting a vicious proxy war. Pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri clashed violently with anti-slavery Free State settlers. This was Bleeding Kansas. For a time, the violence was disorganized. Then, in May 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked the Free State town of Lawrence, destroying its hotel and newspaper offices in what became known as the Sack of Lawrence. John Brown, encamped nearby, resolved to take his revenge. What he did next, on the night of May 24, 1856, would define him. In retaliation for the attack on Lawrence, Brown led a small band, including several of his sons, on a nocturnal raid along Pottawatomie Creek. This was not a battle. They dragged 5 unarmed men and boys, all believed to be slavery proponents, from their homes. They led them into the darkness, where Brown's followers, including his sons, hacked the men to death with broadswords. Brown himself reportedly shot one of the men in the head. It was a calculated act, intended, as Brown later said, to strike terror. This one night of brutal targeted killings, known as the Pottawatomie Massacre, was the match to the powder keg that precipitated the bloodiest period in bleeding Kansas history. Brown was now a hunted man. This act of terror was followed by an act of open warfare. On August 30th, 1856, a pro-slavery force of more than 250 men, led by John W. Reed, marched on Brown's base at Osawatomie, determined to get revenge. Brown was alerted to the attack but was badly outnumbered, with only 30 to 40 Free Staters. The attackers, looping around, surprised Brown's scouts. One of those scouts was Brown's son, Frederick, who was shot and killed. With his son dead, Brown organized a desperate defense along the Marais des Cygnes River, hoping to buy time for the town's residents to escape. The battle was brief. Brown's small force was quickly overwhelmed and forced to retreat. The victorious pro-slavery men then looted and burned the town of Osawatomie. Brown lost the battle, and his homestead was burned to the ground. But the legend of Osawatomie Brown was born. He had now established a dual reputation. To his enemies, he was a ruthless fanatic, the butcher of Pottawatomie. To a growing number of radical abolitionists in the North, he was a hero, a man who had sacrificed his son and fought against impossible odds for the cause of freedom. Brown left Kansas knowing he could not fight this war alone. He needed funds, he needed modern weapons, and he needed powerful, respectable men to provide them. In January 1857, he headed east to Boston. When John Brown arrived in Boston on January 4, 1857, he was no longer just a failed businessman. He was Osawatomie Brown, a frontier hero fresh from the front lines of bleeding Kansas. His disheveled hair and old corduroy suit only enhanced his image as a romantic, authentic freedom fighter. He was seeking money and guns to continue his Free State battles. His first and most crucial contact was Franklin Benjamin Sanborn. Sanborn was, in many ways, Brown's opposite. He was a 26-year-old, idealistic, Harvard-educated intellectual, a Concord schoolmaster who ran in the highest literary circles with figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Crucially, Sanborn was the secretary of the Massachusetts State Kansas Committee, an organization dedicated to supporting the anti-slavery cause in the territory. Brown, with his larger-than-life adventures, immediately impressed the young idealist, and Sanborn agreed to get him whatever he needed. Sanborn became the thread that wove together a small, select group of radical abolitionists. This group, later dubbed the Secret Six, was not a formal committee. They were individuals who rarely, if ever, met all together in the same room. But through Sanborn, they collectively agreed to fund Brown's fight. The group was comprised of some of the most prominent men in New England. George Luther Stearns, a wealthy Massachusetts industrialist and merchant. As president of the Massachusetts-Kansas Committee, he was the group's chief financier. When he met Brown in his Boston factory office, the two men took to each other like the iron and the magnet. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the militant minister who had led the charge on the Boston courthouse during the Anthony Burns affair. An amateur boxer, he had little tolerance for hesitation or weakness, and was the group's most consistently radical member. Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, a physician and a celebrated humanitarian. He was world famous for his pioneering work at the Perkins Institution, especially his success in teaching Laura Bridgman, a student who was blind and deaf. His involvement presented a stark contradiction. Why would a man renowned for his compassion and advocacy for humane treatment agree to fund a violent insurrection? Theodore Parker, an eloquent and controversial Unitarian minister. He was a leading scholar and a major figure in the resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act, known for hiding fugitives in his own home. Gerrit Smith, the only member not from Massachusetts. Smith was an eccentric and very wealthy philanthropist from Peterborough, New York. He was the first of the 6 to meet Brown and had already given him land on which to live in a free black community. He was the group's wealthiest backer, but also its most nervous. The simple explanation for their support was that Brown's frontier charisma dominated them. The reality, however, was far more complex and unsettling. These men, nominally pacifist reformers, harbored a specific set of assumptions. They believed that the condition of servitude had rendered the black man docile, pliant, and prone to collective behavior. They reasoned that just as their own Anglo-American ancestors had proven their character by fighting for freedom, a violent uprising would have a cathartic effect on the Afro-American character. This act of violence, they felt, was a necessary first step toward the assimilation of a new and more individualistic value system, one that mirrored their own democratic industrial North. They were not just funding abolition. They were funding a dark psychological experiment. At first, the money was for Kansas, but Brown had a much more ambitious plan. On February 22, 1858, at Gerrit Smith's home, Brown revealed his true audacious goal to Smith and Sanborn, a raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. He would seize the arsenal's 100,000 rifles, arm the local enslaved population, and ignite a widespread uprising. The 6 agreed to finance this operation. Stearns would provide hundreds of rifles and pikes. They were no longer philanthropists aiding a frontier struggle. They were wealthy, educated, respectable men financing an act of treason. The money from the Secret 6 was collected. The defensive implements, hundreds of rifles and pikes, were purchased by George L. Stearns and shipped. The plan, delayed for a year, was finally in motion. On July 3, 1859, John Brown arrived at a rented farmhouse in Maryland, about 5 miles from Harpers Ferry. He used the alias Isaac Smith, posing as a simple farmer. Throughout the summer, his army gathered. It was a small, dedicated, and diverse group, 21 men in total, including 3 of his sons. To avoid suspicion from curious neighbors, the men were forced to hide in the farmhouse's cramped attic by day, reading, writing letters, and polishing their rifles, emerging only at night for air. To keep up the appearance of a normal household, Brown sent for his 15-year-old daughter, Annie, and his 17-year-old daughter-in-law, Martha. The teens prepared meals and did their best to keep prying neighbors at a distance. This small band was driven by a powerful sense of purpose. 5 of the raiders were black. One of them was Dangerfield Newby. Newby, a tall, strong man, had been born enslaved but was later freed by his father. His wife, however, remained in bondage in Virginia, along with their children. His motive for joining Brown's desperate mission was made clear in a letter found on his body after the raid. It was from his wife. "Dear husband," it read, "I want you to buy me as soon as possible, for if you do not get me, somebody else will. It is said, Master is in want of money. If so, I know not what time he may sell me, and then all my bright hopes of the future are blasted." Newby was fighting to save his family before it was sold away. On September 30th, Brown sent the young women home. The time was near. On the night of Sunday, October 16th, 1859, Brown called his men together. "Men," he said, "get on your arms. We will proceed to the ferry." At 8:01 p.m., Brown and 18 of his men marched on Harpers Ferry. In the first hours, the plan worked flawlessly. By 10:00 p.m., they had taken the bridges and, without firing a shot, captured the U.S. Armory and Arsenal. By midnight, they had taken prominent local enslavers, including Lewis Washington, a relative of George Washington, as hostages from their nearby homes. Then, at 1:25 a.m., the raid began to unravel. A Baltimore and Ohio passenger train was stopped at the bridge. Hayward Shepard, a free African-American baggage handler and railroad employee, went to investigate the delay. Brown's men, posted on the bridge, shot him. Hayward Shepard became the first casualty of the raid to liberate enslaved people. In a second, fatal error, Brown, after holding the train for hours, let it go. It steamed out of Harpers Ferry, carrying the alarm to the outside world. As daylight broke on October 17th, the town awoke and the alarm spread. Messengers rode to nearby towns, carrying news of an uprising. Local militia units formed and firing on the raiders from the surrounding hills. At 10:30 a.m., Dangerfield Newby, standing near the armory gates, was shot. He was the first of Brown's raiders to die. Throughout the day, Brown's men were picked off. Lewis Sheridan Leary, another of the black raiders, was mortally wounded trying to escape across the Shenandoah River. By 3:00 p.m., Brown, his force decimated, retreated with his few remaining men and his hostages into the small brick fire engine house at the armory. The trap was sprung. The raiders were surrounded, the streets filled with hundreds of militiamen. By 11:00 p.m., a new force arrived by train from Washington, D.C., 90 U.S. Marines, under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. On the morning of October 18th, Lee sent his lieutenant, J.E.B. Stewart, to the engine house under a flag of truce to offer terms. Stewart called out for Mr. Smith, Brown's alias. The door opened a few inches, and Stewart immediately recognized the man inside. It was Osawatomie Brown. Brown refused to surrender. Stewart stepped aside and waved his hat, the prearranged signal. The Marines sprang to the assault. They attacked the doors with sledgehammers, but they held fast. The Marines grabbed a heavy ladder and used it as a battering ram, smashing the door from its hinges. They poured inside. One Marine was killed. Lieutenant Israel Green, seeing the leader, struck Brown with his sword, beating him to the ground. The surviving raiders were captured. The hostages were unharmed. The raid, which was supposed to ignite a continental uprising, was over. The courtroom doors splintered. The group of 20 black activists, led by Lewis Hayden, rushed past the stunned marshals. They located Shadrach Minkins, grabbed him, and swept him out of the Boston courthouse. He was spirited through the streets of Boston to a temporary hiding place in an attic near Hayden's home. From there, the Boston Vigilance Committee passed him along the Underground Railroad, moving him across the Charles River to Cambridge and eventually conveying him to safety in Canada. The rescue was a stunning, defiant, and complete success. The federal government was enraged, but Minkins was free. He settled in Montreal, where he ran a barber shop and lived the rest of his life as a free man, dying in 1875. 8 years later, in a Virginia courtroom, there would be no rescue for John Brown. Brown's trial was swift. He was charged with treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, murder, and inciting an insurrection. On November 2, 1859, after a week-long trial, a jury found him guilty on all counts. When asked if he had anything to say before the sentence was passed, Brown, wounded and lying on a cot, rose and stood. In a clear, distinct voice, he addressed the court. "I have, may it please the court, a few words to say," he began. He denied everything but what I have already admitted, of a design on my part to free slaves. He insisted he never intended murder or treason or the destruction of property. His only plan, he claimed, was to repeat his raid into Missouri, where he had freed people without the snapping of a gun. He then turned to his own justification. This court acknowledges, too, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God, he stated, referencing the book he had seen kissed during the trial. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, I have done no wrong, but right. He concluded with a defiant submission that would echo across the nation. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life, for the furtherance of the ends of justice, I say, let it be done. His raid was a military fiasco, but his speech was a stunning victory. It convinced many Northerners that Brown was not a fanatic, but a martyr to the cause of freedom. He had lost the battle, but had seized control of the narrative. For his backers, the Secret Six, the price was now due. The conspiracy was exposed when a carpetbag full of Brown's correspondence was found at the Kennedy farm, implicating his supporters. Their reactions revealed their true characters. Gerrit Smith, the wealthy but nervous philanthropist, panicked. He destroyed all his letters linking him to Brown, and then suffered a complete psychological collapse. His family committed him to the state asylum for the insane in Utica. Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe and George L. Stearns, the book-loving men unaccustomed to such stakes, fled to Canada. They would later testify to a Senate committee that they would have disapproved of the plan had they known its violent details. Theodore Parker, safe in Italy where he was dying of tuberculosis, openly praised Brown as an American saint. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the militant minister, was the only one of the six who did not flee or break down. He stayed in Boston, openly advocated the deed, and expressed only scorn for the cowardice of his fellow conspirators. Franklin Sanborn, the young organizer, initially fled to Canada, but then returned to Concord. On April 3, 1860, 5 federal marshals arrived at his home to arrest him. He resisted, his sister raised an alarm, and the entire town of 150 people surrounded the marshals, refusing to let them take him. Unlike Brown, Sanborn was saved by his community. John Brown was not. On December 2, 1859, he was led to the gallows. As he walked, he handed a final note to one of his guards. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood."